Good morning. I'd like to invite the panelists up while we gather. As Tim mentioned, first congratulations to Tim, and thank you for the warm introduction. I'm the CEO of Satellite Bio. We are an early-stage regenerative medicine company working on delivering solid organ cells as therapeutics. But today I will be moderating this panel of commercial interest in gene therapy. One of the things that Jancy, who sets up great panels across the organization, reminded me is this is my first virtual panel, my first actual in-person panel in like 3 years, that pajama pants were not appropriate attire, so I managed to at least get into a pair of jeans, which was great. And I'm really excited because I've done these panels in the past, and I'm not in the hot seat this time. I get to put people on the hot seat. And because there were so many qualified individuals who could really talk about commercialization in the context of gene therapies. A few years ago, it was usually me and one other person. Now we have multiple people, and it's really an exciting opportunity. So let's get into it. So let me start first, Debbie, with you. You have a couple approvals upcoming. I'm going to just say they're going to happen. I don't want to jinx it. But tell us a little bit about what's happening at CSL Behring and how you're getting ready for your upcoming approvals.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, and good morning, everyone. It certainly is exciting being here in person with everyone in this great location. So yeah, as you said, we hopefully have approvals for Tranidez, as we call it. You know, we were lucky enough to acquire the commercialization rights to this wonderful product, first in class, best in class, from uniQure. So we thank uniQure very much and still work very closely with them, obviously. So we have a PDUFA date of November 22nd. So things are really hotting up, about to get into label discussions with them, and we're in kind of late stage review with Europe. So yeah, fingers crossed, but obviously a lot to do, but very, very exciting times. And we're really thrilled to be at this point with this transformative medicine.
Fantastic. I'm sure we'll get more into it as we go through the day, but I'm going to move on to Chris. So Chris, you know, the stalwart now with a gene therapy that's treated over 2,300 patients, a blockbuster product, inarguably the most successful gene therapy to date. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening with Zolgensma these days and what's next for the whole gene therapies franchise at Novartis?
I would love to, and wonderful to be here today. And Dave, I first want to start off because a lot of the success that we've enjoyed is the fruits of your labor. You had assembled an amazing team, built amazing infrastructure, and I've told you many times personally, but I want to tell you publicly too, how much I appreciate all of that.
That's nice of you. There's challenges too that I'm sure I left
behind. There is. There's always that, but that's been a joy. So yeah, I mean, it has been an extraordinary experience, and as you said, 2,300 patients. Underneath that, you know, there's still so much more to do with our IV formulation, right? We are getting a global footprint from regulatory approval, access, all of those things. But in some ways, it's like we're just getting started. The next bit of work is incredibly difficult because it's places of the world that we never thought were possible. And I know we'll talk about access in a little bit. I think the second biggest thing is what's next. So our intrathecal formulation, which we're in the throes of recruiting for, and this will address the needs of older, heavier babies. The last bit, kind of, you know, taking the baton from you, is what's next for us. And while Novartis is fortunate because we have 20 or so gene therapies in the pipeline, obviously we want to continue strategically using the capabilities, the skills that the team has built in other areas. So we've now expanded kind of our remit to rare disease as well.
Great.
So exciting times.
Thank you. Matt, PTC, long history in rare disease, committed to gene therapy with a Gene Therapy Center of Excellence back in 2020. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening with your pipeline now?
Sure, absolutely. So the big news for us this year was the approval of Upstaza in July for the treatment of AADC deficiency, which is an ultra-rare neurotransmitter disorder. Kids are born without the ability to synthesize dopamine and have profound motor defects and a highly morbid and fatal disorder. And Upstaza basically provides that gene to produce dopamine, and it's administered directly into the brain through a stereotactic surgical procedure. So with our approval in Europe in July, we were the first in vivo gene therapy approved in several years, and the first ever direct administered to the brain gene therapy, which is incredibly exciting and really opens up an entire new frontier when we think about gene therapies for treating neurological and neuromuscular disorders. So we now have launched Upstaza in Europe and are moving forward with submission in the US of a BLA, as well as other submissions worldwide. And as you mentioned, we also have a pipeline of gene therapies. Our next most mature program is in Friedreich ataxia, and then we have a number of other preclinical programs at varying stages of development. You mentioned our Center of Excellence, which was our gene therapy manufacturing facility that we opened in 2020. It's 220,000 square foot facility that allows us to really take production into our own hands, which is incredibly important, not only in general, given the incredible demand for plasmids and vectors, but also obviously over the past few years with all the supply chain shortages related to COVID, it was incredibly important for us to have this ability to advance our programs without needing to rely on external CDMOs. We also, with our capacity for plasmid, both product development and GMP plasmids, as well as GMP AAV vectors, and all the infrastructure we created, we're also able to be a CDMO for others. So we have that capacity, expertise, bioanalytical, quality, every facet of production we now have under one roof at our facility in Hopewell, New Jersey.
That's amazing. So moving on to Tom. Tom, just a quick correction, Chief Commercial and Operations Officer. Want to make sure we clarified that at Bluebird Bio. So congratulations on the 2 approvals in the US, amazing progress. Can you give us some color on how the launches are gearing up?
Sure, absolutely. It's great to be here at ARM live again, and I love seeing the huge audience. So thank you, ARM, for hosting this meeting. I also just wanted to thank real quick patients who were just warriors in our clinical trial and who showed up big time for us at our AdComs and who are curious about the now approved therapies. Without them, we wouldn't obviously be here today. And then I wanted to thank briefly, there are literally dozens of people in this room today who have helped us to get to where we are today, and that's both former Bluebird employees, current Bluebird employees, and then a lot of our strategic partners. And there are hundreds of people back in Boston and out in the field busy launching Zynteglo and Skysona, and we're making great progress. I guess first and foremost, it's just what a great time and transformative time at Bluebird to go from kind of an R&D company to a fully embodied commercial organization. And obviously 2 approvals back to back and 2 launches within 6 weeks of each other has been extremely exciting and also poses some unique challenges going forward. But really hyper concentrate on 3 key areas. I won't go very deep right now, but making sure we're supporting patients and patients' families in their journey through gene therapy, through My Bluebird support. Importantly, we're able to launch My Bluebird support within an hour or 2 of FDA approval. We saw an immediate influx of calls, and a lot of patients were not only requesting enrollment forms, but then returning their enrollment forms. So that's very encouraging and great for patients. Number 2 is our Qualified Treatment Center Network, and that's, we call those QTCs because that's a lot to say every time. But our QTC network, we actively brought on our Wave 1 QTCs, which includes some of the preeminent transplant centers in the US like CHOP and Boston Children's Hospital, Cohen's, and others. And we plan to steadily grow that network through the end of next year to be about 40 or 50 QTCs. And then lastly, as previously mentioned, just our focus on pricing and market access and making sure that the value of a one-time curative therapy is recognized and ultimately reimbursed. And I'll just give a shout out to Clark. I don't know if Clark's in the room, but he's going to be talking about our ICER review in a panel later this week. That'll be a great talk. He was really the superhero behind the scenes that worked closely with ICER to make that happen. So very exciting.
That's super exciting, Tom, so thank you. So Leslie, thanks for waiting patiently on the end there. EU marketing authorization for Livmeldy back in 2020. Tell us what's next for the brand and what's coming behind that for Orchard, who is a longstanding contributor in the gene therapy space.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks for having me on this very esteemed panel. It's really exciting to see so many companies advancing therapies into the commercial setting and really being able to capitalize on this opportunity to bring these amazing medicines to patients. So it's been a very exciting time for Orchard. We've been in the throes of our commercial launch of Livmeldy, which is approved for early onset metachromatic leukodystrophy. And it's gone quite well so far, if I would say myself, given the rarity of the indication and given the difficulty in finding patients currently. We've nonetheless been able to treat 3 commercial patients in the first half of the year. We expect to treat more in the second half of the year. Been very successful securing reimbursement that really acknowledges the tremendous value of this medicine. We've secured reimbursement in Germany, where we have a publicly listed price of over 2.4 million euros. We've also secured reimbursement in the UK, where NICE acknowledged that this product has the highest amount of qualities of any product they've ever evaluated. And we've secured reimbursement in Italy, and we're actively securing reimbursement in a variety of other countries and decision makers throughout Europe. We're also very active in expanding our geographic footprint. We have 5 qualified treatment centers today, and we're setting up additional centers throughout Europe. And we have a very active newborn screening pilot program to facilitate identification of patients who can be treated as early as possible in the disease course and potentially benefit most from that therapy. So that's our work ongoing in Europe, and we're also very excited to hopefully be gearing up to potentially launch this medicine in the US. We're targeting a BLA submission at the end of this year or the beginning of next year. And in the meantime, we've also started to establish a footprint in the US, including setting up newborn screening pilots and establishing a qualified treatment center in the US in Minnesota that allows us to treat patients under compassionate use while we await potential regulatory approval. So very exciting time for Livmeldy. But beyond that, we also have a fairly robust pipeline. We're looking to launch a pivotal study in Hurler syndrome next year. We're also anticipating the readout of proof of concept data in Sanfilippo A. And then we have a number of early stage programs across a variety of indications, including Crohn's disease, HAE, FTD, and really excited to advance those toward the clinic in the coming years as well.
It's amazing. And it's really just wonderful for those patient communities to have options finally for those treatments. So that's, or for their diseases. So amazing progress, and thank you for that. You know, when I think about commercialization, obviously we think about what happens after approval, but actually approval is a really important part of the commercialization process that establishes your label and how you actually are going to be able to go into the marketplace. So I thought we'd start with regulatory considerations, and Leslie, you won't have to wait much too long for a question again. Let me start with you. As you know, we've had a number of hurdles within the gene therapy industry working with regulators. At the same time, I found regulators to be quite flexible in terms of how they approach our products, knowing that there are certain considerations there. PDUFA 7 establishes new funding for, at least on the US side, for the agency and elevation of OTAT into this new Office of Therapeutic Products. What are you expecting to see out of the agency, or what would you like to see come out of the agency to advance the field?
Well, I think we would agree with the agency, given the fact that they are advancing and elevating OTAT to OTP and increasing the staffing of that department by I believe, 33%, that we need to cultivate the resources and expertise to be able to evaluate these therapies efficiently. I think the past couple of years, with attention being diverted to needing to tamp down on the COVID pandemic, which I think we can all agree was very important. Now that we're finally able to get together again in person, it feels like it's been a great success. Having that expertise being cultivated and having reviewers that are becoming more and more comfortable with the product profiles and similar patterns that you're seeing across products in similar classes should facilitate the ability for reviewers and the agency to become more comfortable with understanding these products and maybe being able to anticipate certain questions and provide guidance very early in the process that will enable companies to tailor development as effectively as possible relative to what we were able to do a decade ago when this was all very new, right? I think the other thing that's very helpful for us, and this may come up again later, is the focus on patient centricity, the increased emphasis on guidance documents that talk about how companies can best engage with patients to design studies, to make sure you're choosing endpoints that are going to be most clinically meaningful and at the same time measurable with these types of therapies, the fact that they're engaged in so many patient-focused drug development listening sessions, including one coming up in MLD, one coming up in gene therapy. I think we're all very aligned that given the number of programs that are coming through and the complexity of the programs coming through, there needs to be a great amount of resources diverted to this and a lot of focus on what's going to be most meaningful to patients. So I'm really excited that it appears to be moving in a direction that's going to facilitate our ability to do even more of this work.
Yeah, it's really an amazing opportunity to increase capacity, expertise, and I heard you say efficiency, throughput of what we can expect from the agency, which will be great. You know, that time before approval, while you're waiting for that approval, is really a tense time for the community in particular, and how you handle pre-approval utilization. You mentioned compassionate use, Leslie, before. Matt, I was wondering, how does PTC think about the access to therapies prior to approval, and how do you manage that with the patient community?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I want to say that, you know, an integral part of both development, every stage of drug development, and obviously the regulatory process, is about partnership with the patient community. I think this has been the hallmark of rare disease drug development for decades, and is certainly going to be true and has been true in gene therapies for rare disorders. And, you know, we're also in a special situation, certainly with one-time administered gene therapies, that's different than when you have a repeat administered small molecule, for example, where you can leverage compassionate use programs and expanded access programs as really a mechanism to accelerate commercialization on the other side of approval. Obviously, with a one-time administered therapy, you have to think very carefully about how that plays out. For us, we've had a number of different approaches to this. In Europe, we availed ourselves of early access programs. Actually, our first commercially treated patient was from the AP1 program in France. And so we were able to leverage the fact that we can treat patients prior to finalizing pricing and negotiation. We plan in our commercial launch in Europe, we've said that Germany will be our first official launch country, but we're also looking to other countries like France that have early access programs that allow us to provide commercial drug prior to finalizing reimbursement discussions. We've also, well, let me mention one particular unique aspect of launching a surgically administered drug is you have to not only prepare for typical launch things in terms of patient education, KOL networking, driving diagnosis, patient finding, but we also had to establish surgical centers of excellence. Our gene therapy is directly administered to the putamen of the brain, which is the site of dopaminergic neuron activity, and it really requires surgical expertise, having centers where the surgeons are trained and comfortable doing these procedures, and also where there's appropriate training and experience for perioperative care, preoperative care, postoperative ICU care, having physical therapy, all the different aspects of management of the patient that are going to be critical to long-term outcome. So what we've been able to do, we have a clinical study that's been ongoing in the United States to gain experience with the cannula that we're going to use commercially. That was part of our preparation for BLA submission. And we've also used this as an opportunity to identify and gain experience at our centers for excellence. This is AADC deficiency is an ultra-rare disease, and we're able to think about identifying in a strategic fashion, geographic diversity in terms of centers of excellence, where there's the neurosurgical expertise, there's pediatric neurology centers of excellence, and we can marry the two and allow for appropriate experience at these centers before approval, before commercial launch, so that when we go to launch, we have these centers identified, they're experienced, and it works very smoothly for the patients. We've done a similar strategy in Europe, where we've identified centers of excellence throughout Europe. Again, a factor of both having the appropriate pediatric neurosurgical experience as well as pediatric neurology centers of excellence, where they are caring for children with neurotransmitter diseases. We've also done a lot of work for cross-border health. That'll be another component of our launch, knowing that we're not going to have centers of excellence in every country, but we want to make sure that we provide access to the therapy for all children. And so that's another thing that we've been also working on as we move forward with our launch in Europe.
That's, thanks for the comprehensive response. I think it speaks to the obligation we have to the community, and certainly I know you probably have the experience that it builds credibility with the community, but it also really is an opportunity for companies, especially early stage companies who maybe this is the first launch in the space, to learn along the way, because it is not simple to commercialize these therapies, as you point out. All right, so we know what we want the agency to do. We know how we have to manage the community. We get to the really important part of regulatory, which is our label negotiations. And you mentioned it already, Debbie, that you guys were coming into that stage. tell us about how you, what you've seen in this trends in this regard, and how you guys are approaching label negotiations for your gene therapies.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dave. As you said, really, really important time, and I think everybody's learning in a way. You know, the agencies, even for us, like we're coming into a space that we actually already know pretty well. Haemophilia B, we've launched in haemophilia B before with a chronic therapy. So the differences, you know, with this one-time therapy versus a chronic therapy, you know, are quite profound, and when you start to think about label, it does have quite an effect. So with chronic therapies, historically, at least in haemophilia, the agencies have given quite broad labels, albeit because it's a rare disease, it's been quite a narrow study that you might have done. But they had good understanding of the disease area, and the products, replacement therapies have been around a long time, so they knew what to look for. But they, to be honest, are struggling a bit now with a one-time therapy, albeit at the end of the day, all we're doing is getting the body to produce the factor itself. So they're thus far, you know, and there's only been a couple, they're sticking pretty close to the studied population. And they're really not wanting to veer outside of that, which I guess is understandable because, you know, we go into these with, you know, 1 to 2 years of data, knowing that we're looking for 10, 15, 20 years of efficacy, and we don't have that readout today. So there is a struggle. There's a struggle around durability. You know, in Europe, they've been giving conditional approval. We expect that probably to continue, and like I said, restricting the label. And even if the regulator doesn't restrict the label, the payer probably will anyway. So it really is, you know, a unique time, particularly in areas where there are already existing therapies, you know, trying to have that conversation. But I would say thus far, the conversations have been really good. You know, and again, it's easier for both sides because even the agencies know haemophilia quite well. I think it's very different for some of the guys that are going into brand new areas of you know, diseases, so the agency doesn't understand the disease very well. So we probably have a little bit of an advantage there. Yep. Nonetheless, it's still, we'll see what happens in the next couple of months.
Yeah, I mean, you speak to the selection of the indication population, which is really difficult. Often when we run our trials a certain way, we're kind of stuck with that population potentially. And then the claims you can make, right? We want to make durability claims, but often the data's not yet available, even though we know in principle these things should last for a long time.
Yep.
Any other points anyone else would raise about their recent or past label negotiations and how that impacts your thinking about commercialization?
I would say that this is certainly a place, again, where it's very helpful to engage the patient community, certainly, and the physician community. I think that was something that was very helpful to us as we were moving through the process in Europe, to be able to have physicians clearly articulate to the regulatory bodies that, look, this is a gene therapy and the disease pathology is not reliant on the patient's age. And often the patients that we treat in a clinical trial, there's some strategy there to ensure that you're getting a population in whom your endpoints are most sensitive to change so that you can demonstrate a market effect over a short period of time. But that doesn't mean that other patients wouldn't benefit. And so we obviously as companies have to make that argument, but it's also bolstered, I think, in the eyes of the regulatory authorities when you have experts in the field who can talk about their practices and the impact they believe the therapy can have, and then also the patients. To say that there's need for all patients, not just maybe the group that fits the specific inclusion criteria of a trial.
Yeah. It's a great point. It speaks to how important it is where, for conditions the agency might not be as familiar with, how important that engagement is with the community and with experts. All right, so you all have now gotten your products approved. The headline is not your product approval, it's how much you're charging for that product. That's day one of any gene therapy approval and launch. I was thinking about ordering the panel in highest price to lowest price, but I'll let you guys do that in your heads. Tom, let me start with you. You guys are working with payers and stakeholders now to think about value, access, reimbursement. Tell us a little bit about your strategies and what those discussions have been like.
Yeah, so obviously it's been said already, but thinking about gene therapy and especially some of these chronic conditions and rare diseases is thinking about medicine completely differently. And we really need to continue to work together to demonstrate value in a way that really hasn't been recognized before. And with Zynteglo, we priced Zynteglo at $2.8 million for patients, all patients with beta thalassemia who require red blood cell transfusions on a regular basis. And if you look at that disease and you look at the burden of disease, and it was mentioned in the opening discussion, this is really not only an incredibly burdensome disease on patients and families. These patients are going in every 2 to 5 weeks for an entire day in the hospital where they get a blood cell transfusion. They then are managing their iron and managing other parts of their disease outside of the hospital. And so imagine spending about a month every year off of work, off of school, traveling to the hospital to get your blood cell transfusion and still not feeling very good, feeling tired and dealing with iron overload at times. So really the burden on families and patients is enormous. And if you look at the burden on the healthcare system, and again, Clark is going to cover this in his ICER review talk tomorrow, but this is a disease where it's well published that it costs up to $6.4 million on average for a single patient to go through therapy for beta thalassemia, and then they lose decades of life at the end of the day. So this is really, maybe an under-recognized burdensome disease. And then you look at just making sure that the value of that you go in one time for your gene therapy, and then it's pretty much done. And I'll just cap it off anecdotally with a patient that was able to come into our office a few weeks ago, who was one of the first patients treated in our 210 study who had beta thalassemia, and she's now thriving, continues to be transfusion independent, and now has a full-time job thinking about moving to a different state, which is just outstanding. And I think, again, partnering with patients and the community to help understand the value is critically important.
That's really true. We've seen better, I would say, better reimbursement, more consistent reimbursement uptake in the U.S. so far. In other markets outside of the U.S., it's been more inconsistent. You guys had to remove a product from the market. We had that experience, and that's happened for a couple folks. At the same time, Chris, I know that Zolgensma actually has close to 70% of sales outside of the U.S. now, around the world. So tell us a little bit about how you've managed those challenges and really generated success in getting reimbursement on a gene therapy outside of the U.S.
Yeah, I would say there's not one answer for this, right? It's very bespoke and very centric to what that country's needs are, what that ecosystem's needs are. And that sounds easy to say, but it's really hard to unpack because, to Tom's point, it is about that value discussion, but their tolerance is all over the map for what that means to them in their specific ecosystem. I mean, we've had success in the places that are more established, like the UK and Germany. Those have been easier. But then there's countries that they're saying it's going to be only self-pay, or they don't have the infrastructure to support this. So you can't even unpack the ICER value with them. It becomes a very thoughtful conversation, but it takes months and, in our case, sometimes years. What I am super hopeful about, though, is, having been in the industry for about 30 years, I would never think it would be possible to see countries like Chile and Ecuador, Egypt, as another example that we have gotten through, and through those conversations. Now, I think the biggest onus on all of us is how do we do this as a collective community now? Because as more products get approved, right, that pressure and that value proposition isn't going to seem so elegant, because now they're going to think, my goodness, now I have all these choices of grievous illness. Which ones do I pick? So I think those are going to be things that I hope over the next months and years we solve together as a group.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, because in many ways we have to think about what's our obligation to low and middle income countries when we think about these conditions. Some of these countries, are disproportionately impacted by genetic disease due to founder effects or specifics of their population, and it really is it's going to take a thoughtful approach to figure out how we get these what are now quite expensive to produce therapies into these kind of markets. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, just want to add to that I think is very important. I think it was Tim that said it earlier, but meeting our key audiences where they are is extremely important. And just to go back historically with Bluebird, one of the things that we used to think would work was payment over time. And so we were thinking of a pricing and reimbursement scheme that was really a payment over 5 years. And we had to quickly in the last year and a half kind of change that way of thinking, because to Chris's point, a lot of the payors and a lot of other stakeholders weren't set up to do payment over time. So focusing more on something that they did want, which was more of an outcomes-based agreement based on our primary endpoint that was easily trackable. So I think it's important to learn from our key partners and audiences and meet them where they are.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tom. Thank you. So, of course, access and reimbursement, critically important to get patients access to therapy, but it's not the only key to success when we think about how we launch gene therapy. So a really important topic I would like to talk about or spend some time on is how we go to market. So how do we actually think about the commercial infrastructure, medical infrastructure, supply chain infrastructure necessary to support a product launch in the gene therapy space. I think a really first interesting place to start is that whenever you have a launch, the first people who call the company are patients themselves and caregivers who have been waiting for this therapy, often been tracking it for decades, or for at least a really long time. So Leslie, I wanted to come to you. What are the best practices when you think about engaging the patient community and really managing their expectations about what's going to be possible for access to therapy?
Well, I think we would all agree that if the first time you're engaging with the patient community is when you're putting together your launch plan, you are way, way behind.
For sure.
This is a relationship that needs to be cultivated from the earliest stages of development as you're thinking about what is the unmet need, how can you best measure the unmet need, what is the questions or concerns the community might have about the safety and efficacy of gene therapies, and how can you partner to design a trial that is going to motivate participation of those caregivers and their children for a very long time, right? For upwards of 15 years of follow-up in the case of integrating vectors, for example. So having that dialogue in the earliest stages of design is critical. We know, again, the agency is also having these dialogues with the patient communities as we're approaching the agencies for scientific advice on development programs. So having that consistent thread of communication between the patient community, the company, and the regulators as all of this is coming together is really critical. And I think this element of education around what is the value that this product is bringing oftentimes is greatly facilitated by the experience of the patient community itself, who has participated in these trials and can speak firsthand to what they are seeing in themselves and in their children, and have the potential to then be advocates for the rest of the community and the broader infrastructure supporting drug development and approvals in articulating why these are therapies that should be brought to market, what is the potential commercial value of these therapies that they would be supportive of in the real world setting. I think the Bluebird experience with the advisory committee really speaks to the power of having a very motivated and a patient community that can speak from their own experience about the benefits that these therapies have brought to them. So early engagement, frequent engagement, and having that regular engagement as part of the process you're building to launch, so you have a community that's speaking with one voice about what a transformative opportunity you have to change care of patients through these therapies.
Yeah, it's a great point and great, comprehensive response that needs to occur throughout the life cycle of a product. One of the things that happens at launch is often board members start to call. I found, this patient emailed me, can we get them treatment? Patients are reaching out, families are reaching out to you desperately across the world. What's the infrastructure, and this is an open question to anyone, what's the infrastructure and how do you manage it for the team to engage in that, what can be really difficult conversations?
Yeah, I'm happy to start.
Yeah, Tom.
So I think the first thing you need to do is set clear expectations, and with at least our approvals, there was a time from FDA approval to the time where we could actually start to enroll and treat a patient. I think this is a very natural onboarding process where you have to go sign final documents, and without getting into the weeds too much, you have to obviously make sure that your manufacturing facility is ready to go. So I think, unfortunately, some patients think the second you get approved, they're going to sign up and get treated the next day. And at least in our case, and with the gene therapies that I've seen, there's also a longer time between cell collection and when we're ready to ship the cells back than say with the CAR T. With CAR Ts, it's like 19 or 20 days, I think. And now with ours, it's 70 to 90 days, and just really setting the expectation that it's not going to happen overnight. And in most cases, that's okay. That allows the qualified treatment centers to schedule based on their convenience. That allows patients to schedule at their convenience. But really, number one, setting clear expectations. And then number two, having a pretty well and clearly defined process for those patients that may need to get treated urgently before you can actually treat a patient commercially.
Yeah, look, I'd probably add, Dave, you know, as we're getting ready for launch, one of the key areas of focus is that patient journey and the patient support systems that you need to set up, because, yeah, they do have expectations. With Etranades for Hem B, there's a screening process that they've got to go through that, you know, is quite a lot for them. And so that education around everything that needs to be done is really, really important. And we've found, you know, having the patients from the clinical trial help us do that education is just really, really, really important. So, you know, as everyone said, and particularly Leslie, you've got to work with the patients, not just for them. You know, I think we've always listened to patients, but I think in the past we listened to them and then we made our own decisions internally. With all sorts of therapies, but particularly with gene therapies, you've got to be with them every single step of the journey, and you've got to be ready to do that. And like Leslie said, if you're waiting till the day you get approved to start that process, it's way too late. You know, we licensed this in quite late, and we've been running 1,000,000 miles an hour to try and get everything in place, and so we didn't really have enough the kind of time that you would prefer. So it's years of time to get ready if you want to be successful.
Great. I think, Chris, what were you going to say? Sorry.
Yeah.
Chris, go ahead.
I'll just jump in to pick up on what you're saying. I mean, I think the learnings have been exponential in this space, particularly regarding patient advocacy. So everything you all have said about understanding the patient journey, I think historically as an industry, we have a penchant to solve problems that aren't really there because we think that they're sexy or they make sense. It doesn't work this way in our context. And so I think that ongoing conversation is really important. I'd also say very tactically though, there are things like newborn screening that patient advocacy opens massive doors. I mean, we have 90%, over 90% plus, 95% plus newborn screening in the US. That wouldn't have been possible had the organizations that we've partnered with, had they not, you know, really state by state helped us analyze what were the levers we were going to pull. I'd also say with real world evidence, so sustainability and registry, they're so insightful on the things that we would get wrong, even on how we would talk to the patient community. And so there's nuanced things, and then there's very tactical deliverables that I think those relationships have produced in spades. And I can't imagine now a launch that we would go into not having that runway and deep understanding ingrained in kind of how we approach the market and patients.
I think I can follow very nicely on that. In addition to obviously the medical teams and the field teams that are part of a commercial organization, we have a very robust patient engagement team that has been an incredible part of our company from the beginning in our early work in other rare disorders. And they've been incredibly helpful in liaising with patient advocacy groups, setting expectations about timelines and what's actually involved in getting therapy. And that's been very valuable. But we also had a whole another issue to tackle in an ultra rare disease like AADC deficiency, which is patient finding. And helping get diagnosis, offering no-cost testing from suspected diagnosis all the way through confirmation. We also found that, which often occurs in rare diseases where there's a significant unmet medical need, no approved therapies, no standard of care, is that a lot of the kids with AADC deficiency were misdiagnosed. It's actually very helpful to have a diagnosis of a disease where families can get resources and support. So we found that many children with AADC deficiency were labeled as having cerebral palsy or epilepsy. And so we did a lot of patient finding in those clinics. And so one of the next steps we took was opening up a registry program so that while we're waiting to be able to have access and be able to provide therapy commercially, we're able to not only follow patients and learn about the natural history of the disease, but that also provides patients and the families access to things like nutrition and physical therapy, things that they may not have gotten as part of the disease because they were either undiagnosed or had the wrong diagnosis and weren't plugged into the appropriate centers. And also, of course, having appropriate nutrition status and physical therapy techniques all will improve the outcome of the surgical procedure and the gene therapy treatment once it's provided. So it is really a multifaceted approach to identifying patients, continuity, engaging with advocacy groups, and really having a structure that allows for, ultimately access to care and successful outcome of treatment.
Yeah, I mean, it's so important. The concept of a one-time therapy is it's not sufficient in our cases often, because you actually want continuation of care to occur to actually get the full benefit of the therapeutic potential. So I always a little bit shake when I hear one-time therapy, because it's not the end-all be-all. You already started to hit on, Matt, like what are the components of team you need to build this launch. So I'm going to start with you, Debbie. Yep. What's your go-to-market approach that you're taking for hemophilia B, which is a relatively big, but in some regards already served population of patients?
Yeah, and as I said, probably luckier than some of my colleagues up here, because we've been in hemophilia B for quite some time, and so we have a pre-established team in pretty much every country. However, it is different, and I think we have added a lot more. We have patient engagement teams, but we've added a lot more around the patient support. We're bringing on, a lot more medical support, because the education component is really, really important. The market access, we've had to bolster, definitely, our market access teams, both our global and our regional and our local teams. So pretty much all aspects of commercialization. We've lucky that we've had that kind of basis to build from. But I would say mainly the medical and the market education, the patient engagement, patient advocacy, people talked about. We've bolstered our policy team, as well, because this is kind of a 360-degree activity. I think, gone are the days, and particularly for gene therapy, a massive marketing machine is not enough for gene therapy.
Yep.
And in fact, you could probably argue that marketing is one of the lower requirements. Sorry to all my marketing colleagues. You still need some cool materials. So, but I think gone are the days where a massive marketing machine could successfully launch a gene therapy, because you need that interaction directly with the patients, their families. We're kind of similar to Tom and Bluebird. You can't give this gene therapy everywhere. We'll have specialty haemophilia treatment centres, so a lot of training and support for them as well. So yeah, it's a big effort.
Yeah. Tom, you're preparing for launch or in launch. Similar question, maybe if I can throw a new one in there too, is, if you have $1 to spend, how do you allocate it across all these functions?
Well, it's a good question, and just maybe to build on what Debbie said for a second, I think part of the reason that my role expanded a little bit is looking at just the supply chain part of things, because this is a one-time therapy, so to speak, but it's a 6 trillion step process, and you want to make that process as seamless and simple as possible. So taking the complex and making it simple, and when you build your supply chain plan and your commercial plan in silos, it's very hard to do that. So making sure that you have a cohesive strategy for every step of the gene therapy journey. As far as dollars spent, we are coming through a period where, it's going back 9 months in history. We split Bluebird in half, and we took the gene therapies, but we also went through a period of downsizing and right-sizing our footprint for Zynteglo and Skysona. And then the idea is that we will then start to build that footprint back for sickle cell disease, which we hope we're on track to file in Q1 of next year. But our approach had to be, as Debbie said, it couldn't be throw money at everything, get the right size, get focus, and spend it. In our case, I like to say boots on the ground, but it's really those relationships and being in the QTCs, working with payors, hand to hand, so to speak.
Yep. Leslie, the medical team plays such an important role in educating the community as you launch these therapies, and in many ways I often think they're the customer-facing organization for a gene therapy. How do you prepare your medical teams for launch?
I completely agree, and I think the medical team, certainly for our European launch, has been absolutely critical in enabling centers to be ready to treat. They've been responsible for the training of these centers on these incredible logistics of ex vivo HSC lentiviral gene therapy, very similar situation that the Bluebird team is dealing with regard to the complexity of administering the therapy and just the logistics of patients moving to and from the hospital, the product moving to and from the hospital to the manufacturing site, sometimes over an ocean in the case of patients who've been treated in the United States. And these, to be clear, the centers that we've identified that are administering Livmeldy in Europe are the centers that would be the most obviously qualified to do this because they have the juxtaposition of transplant expertise and the expertise in managing leukodystrophies and in some cases transplanting other types of leukodystrophies. So, but even in that case, the number of things that need to go right for you to get the best possible outcome, it's a huge compendium of information. And so our medical team has been very boots on the ground training in the local language on the logistics for each of the 30 plus members of the clinical team on site that are involved in some aspect of whether it be the initial assessment or the conditioning procedure or the transplant itself or the monitoring or the long-term follow-up. All of those steps need to be going well for the patient to have a positive outcome. I think the other area where our medical team has really been essential, and Chris alluded to this, is the importance of newborn screening and getting those data sets generated that are going to enable countries and states to adopt national or state level, or in the case of the US, RUSP level newborn screening. We're coming in an indication where there isn't newborn screening in place today, and for us to be able to get to the place where patients can truly benefit from the therapy the way we see it, we need to move very, very quickly. And this means very quickly generating data and partnering with influencers on the ground in the medical community as well as in the patient community together to move toward legislative action. So I think those areas in particular, the training of our treatment centers and the building up of that infrastructure, as well as those essential steps toward patient identification, have really been spearheaded by our medical organization very effectively.
That's great insight. Chris, for a mature product, how does the commercial model evolve over time?
Great question. I was just going to jump in and say, can I add? I'm just going to sound, a little bit of bad news, but it really is. I mean, as you guys have very elegantly described it, you're doing everything you possibly can to launch really well. So it's kind of all in. Now we find ourselves in a situation where our expansion is in very difficult parts of the world, right? So you're not going to, descend a team on that space. And we have had some reshaping, downsizing, restructuring with the notion of saying, okay, what's next around the corner, whether it's our own pipe or external innovation? How do we build a commercial model that's sustainable? And I don't know that we have this, perfect answer yet, but certainly the idea is that we've started to break up parts of Europe and go into international and say we need to take that learning and those talents and have them now go serve other countries. Well, it's very difficult to tell extraordinary talent, now I need you to go work in Saudi Arabia. There isn't a penchant to want to do that. So we're kind of trying to figure that out and mobilize small regional teams that now can, in combination with medical and patient advocacy, some of the key ingredients to now really, really deeply understand those markets. So I'll tell you next year how it goes. Right now we're in the throes of it. And,
it's an evolving process for sure, and we'll look forward to having you on the panel next year.
I didn't mean that as an invite.
Thanks for signing up in advance. All right, in the final few minutes, let's close. Matt, I'll start with you. It's the freebie. What are you most excited about in the gene therapy space and when it comes to thinking about the impact we can have commercializing these therapies?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was in medical school a couple decades ago now, the human genome was cloned, and I remember my genetics professor standing up in the front of the room saying, now that we have the human genome cloned, we're going to have gene therapy and solve every disease. And of course, it's now been over 2 decades later, and I think we're still in the early stages. I think we have to be incredibly excited, as Emil talked about and Tim talked about, the number of approvals this year. I think that is an incredible achievement for the gene therapy community, which includes us as companies, but most importantly, patients. I think that the ability to provide gene therapies that can be transformative therapies and really deliver on the promise of genes broke, we can fix it, and if not slow a disease, maybe even deliver a disease cure. And I think the fact that we have drugs getting approved or gene therapies getting approved tells us that we've learned a lot of important things in terms of manufacturing, clinical development. The regulatory authorities have learned a lot. We've learned how to work with regulatory authorities. We've learned how to put all these pieces together. And so I think what excites me most is I think we've got everything in place to now have that expected, anticipated upswing of more therapies, more effective therapies, not only for rare diseases, but for more common diseases.
That's super. Leslie, what are you excited about?
I'm really excited to just continue to see the growth and adoption of Livmeldy in Europe as more and more countries are coming online and being able to administer the product locally, being able to reimburse the product as patients are able to access the product coming from countries where we're not actively commercializing. So for example, we have patients who have come from the Middle East and access commercial product at treatment centers in Europe. And of course, really excited at the prospect of a potential commercial launch in the US. We've had so many discussions with the FDA to really educate them on the unmet need and the potential of Livmeldy to really transform outcomes for these patients. I think that the fact that we've been able to secure compassionate use emergency INDs for patients on US soil is a testament to the agency's learning about the unmet need and the outcomes that we've been able to provide with this therapy, and I look forward hopefully to a upcoming commercial launch in the US.
Awesome, thank you. Tom, your thoughts?
So yeah, I could be really quick. I think for me, long term is about the next 6 months because I think we have a long ways to go as Bluebird. I'm fortunate enough to be sitting up here with Chris, but as Bluebird, we have to prove a commercial model now. We have to prove that we can deliver the gene therapies now commercially to patients. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention sickle cell disease. For us, it's about proving gene therapy models today for both beta thalassemia and CALD, but also filing our BLA for sickle cell disease. And sickle cell is such an underserved and almost ignored patient population that we need to continue to blaze trails for every patient population that we can. And then longer term, I think it's things like reduced toxicity conditioning, improved mobilization, and for us, potentially eventually in vivo. But right now, the focus is on the next 6 months and getting it right.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. Chris?
So I'd say, just looking at my own organization, I'm most excited about kind of continuing to transform our culture and on this structure and change of the scale and scope of our business. How are we going to take all the capabilities we've built and now translate those to the next thing and the next thing after that? So exciting, but very daunting. And then I'd say at a macro level, I'm super excited about having the chance to learn from everyone in the room, but also the scale that hopefully the innovation is going to bring collectively. Because I think our growth and our learning is going to be exponential over the next couple of years, given the base that's been set in the previous few.
That's great.
Last word for me.
Yeah.
So obviously excited about the upcoming launch. You know, this is something we've been putting a lot of work into, really excited to kind of hand this over to the countries now, which is our model. But also really excited to show the value that these therapies are going to bring. Tom touched on it, you know, and there's probably not enough about for areas that are quite expensive today to treat. And while haemophilia people have a lot of options, it's still quite burdensome. You know, their lives aren't normal. And gene therapy brings the opportunity to be normal. And I think for normal people, it's hard for us to understand the value of that. So it's not only to help the people with haemophilia, but in the longer term, to really help society and bring cost savings to society, which I'm sure all countries could do with. So exciting times.
Yeah, it's really amazing, and the degree and scale of patient impact that all of these therapies can have is really fantastic. And I just share with you one story in closing, and I'm a couple of years removed from my prior role, but I recently had an email from a mom who said, "You don't know me, but here's my 3-year-old walking." Yeah. And it's that patient impact, that individual opportunity to help a family, to help a patient live a life they wouldn't normally would, is the promise that we have. And we can do that now 1,000 times over for families with all the therapies you guys are launching. So thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for the panel today.
Thanks, guys.